Hello. So for this video, we're going to talk about the logical fallacy, the hasty generalization. So generalizations, as you probably know, are actually incredibly important in terms of how we think about things, how we understand the world around us, and how we draw mental maps for ourselves. They're a fundamental component of human cognition. We can't get away from generalizations. But not all generalizations are reliable. And so this is where the issue of the hasty generalization comes in. Basically, this is a generalization, something that you believe about a large group based on too small a sample size, right? So that's a generalization. The first part of that is a generalization, something that's believed about a wide category of things, whether that's people, whether that's countries, whether that's animals, whether that's chemicals, whether that's college students, whatever it is. Any sort of group of things that have some unifying element, you can make generalizations about, things that are typically true of things in that category. Now, when those generalizations are based on a relatively wide swath of evidence, they can be quite useful, quite trustworthy and reliable. But when they're based on a limited amount of evidence, then they're not necessarily reliable. And again, this is one of those things. This is one of the important things to keep in mind with logical fallacies. The generalization itself might actually be true, but if the argument that's being made is dependent on a small sample size of evidence, then the argument is not reliable. So you can have the hasty generalization fallacy even if the conclusion being drawn is true. The argument itself is structurally unsound. So, how do you determine whether or not a generalization is a hasty generalization? Yeah, to be honest, this is really quite a tricky question. There is no objective number of subjects within a category that you would need to observe in order to establish concretely that a generalization is reliable. In principle, unless you have a 100% observation rate, any generalization could be untrue for a particular member of a category. Whether or not something is a hasty generalization, I think really kind of comes down to the individual context of the generalization, right? And I guess the other element it comes down to is whether or not people are persuaded that this is enough data to draw the conclusion being drawn. And those are very contextual elements. And in a way, I don't feel bad setting those as the kind of parameters, because the reality is that this is very true of rhetoric, right? This is a very common standard thing in rhetoric, is that the situation determines whether or not an argument is really reliable. What might be considered a reliable generalization in one context may be considered a hasty generalization in another. I know that's not super helpful, but again, part of the thing is that if you're going to analyze an argument looking for examples of logical fallacies or looking for instances where their logic breaks down, you would need to be prepared to make the argument that any fallacy you identify is the fallacy you identify. So this is a really important thing. And then from a writer's perspective, not a rhetorical analysis writer, but like an argumentative writer in general, you want to avoid the hasty generalization because let's say you have a population of 100 and you look at 2 subjects in that population. If you try and say all members of this population have these characteristics, or even most members of this population have these characteristics, on the basis of 2 observations, many readers likely will not be convinced. So again, this is ultimately what, from a writer's perspective, from a rhetor's perspective, this is what awareness of logical fallacies comes down to. If I can't support my claims with reliable structures of argument and reliable evidence, the argument isn't likely to persuade people. So you want to be thinking about those things. So I'll give you, I guess, a couple of examples of hasty generalizations. For the sake of simplicity, I'm teaching this semester out of The Structure of Argument by Annette Rottenberg and Donna Winchell. So I'm just going to borrow some of their examples because I think some of them are reasonably good. So here's a few of their examples of hasty generalizations. That elderly driver cut me off. Old people shouldn't be allowed to drive. So this is an argument that assumes that because one old person is a bad driver, that must necessarily be a characteristic of all old people. It's also worth noting that old people is a very vaguely defined category in this context. But in this instance, the example takes one instance of behavior and applies it across the board to a group. And so in this case, it's unreliable because this is a tiny, minuscule proportion of old people in the world, many of whom I'm sure are good drivers. I don't know that for sure one way or the other, but I assume that to be true. So in that case, it's an unreliable argument, but more importantly, from a rhetorical perspective, it's unlikely to persuade people, right? If we have one instance, one piece of evidence, it's unlikely to persuade us that an entire group shares a certain characteristic. From an ethical perspective, it's some ageist bullshit. But, again, it's an example of a bad argument, so there you go. So here's another one. I've got to wear my lucky Clemson shirt. We never lose when I wear it. Possibly so far. This is a superstitious one, right? This is a superstitious idea, which is actually, in my opinion, a superstition is a better example of the post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy, which I'll talk about in another video. But superstition is also connected to the hasty generalization because it links a particular outcome with a particular event and then assumes that event, or it assumes that outcome will occur every time that event happens, right? So I wear my Clemson shirt, we win the game, until we don't. And this is actually where the post hoc fallacy comes in, is the assumption of a causal relationship. But there's also a hasty generalization element here, that whenever I do X, this will be the outcome. That may or may not be the case. And because in reality, we are aware that Clemson's sports, it doesn't even specify what sport in this example. I'm assuming football because this is an American written textbook, but we'll go with that. So Clemson football team their relative ability to win games is not dependent on the shirt worn by a particular fan. It's simply unconnected. And so, it may have occurred so far that every time you wear the Clemson shirt, you don't lose, but that doesn't tell you what's going to happen going forward. And of course, hasty generalizations are very often the source of things like racism, xenophobia, sexism, any sort of racial, ethnic, religious, gendered, sexuality, etc. stereotyping is based in hasty generalizations. And so they are, for the most part, unreliable because they simply apply a small number of examples, frequently cherry-picked examples, to try and establish a broad generalization about a group.